Will Graves, and I think he's going to probably tell us that they are now passing 50,000, but last I heard of the Akron figure was 22,000.
Closing in on 23.
Yeah. So anyway, he'll tell you all about the pension records, and then we'll take a little bit longer break, and then back to dinner at 6 o'clock.
It takes me back to the days when I was a college professor, and the main difference between then and now is that in those days I felt like I knew more than the students. But since I became a historian, I have a lot more questions than I have answers, and these are a couple of them. And we need to address the second question first, because if the pension applications can't be trusted, there's no point in talking about what the pension applicants said. When Will Graves started this project about 15 years ago, and I joined him maybe a year later, we had no idea whether the pension applications would be proved useful or not, or whether they could even be trusted. Most of the applications were made 40 or 50 years after the events that were described, and there was money involved, so there might have been a temptation to commit fraud. But as we got into it, I think we both gained more confidence. It was worth continuing the project of transcribing the pension applications. This is Will Graves receiving a citation for the progress we had made thus far. I think it was about 10,000 at that time. And he's showing the expression that we usually have when we get cited for doing something like this, an expression of surprise and gratification for doing something we just do for fun anyway. It is really a lot of fun. One of the things that really surprised both of us was that more people didn't want to join and do it with us. I think we may be the last two people who can still read cursive and make claims when nobody else wants to join us. Can I see a show of hands of how many people have seen this website before? Oh, that's great. Good. I won't have to go into great detail about that, and I just want to point out a few things. And one of them is that you can always get in touch with Will or me if you have a question or a request, and especially if you spot an error. We do appreciate having the opportunity to correct errors. And the most important part of this page is this, the searches. And what I'm going to talk about today is possible because you can search every word, every combination of words, or every phrase in these transcribed pension applications. For example, I searched the word Marion, and I came up with about 1,500 hits. And I was surprised to see how many places are named after Francis Marion. 17 counties in the U.S. are named after him. It's much more efficient to search for Francis Marion. Will and I always take care, at least once in each pension transcription, to spell out the full name correctly so that you don't have to search every possible variant spelling. And then let's move down a little bit more. At the time I made this slide on the 22nd of this month, we were up to 22,900 and some pension applications and almost 300 rosters, payrolls and muster rolls. And we're now, well, we have completed all of the soldiers that we have identified as serving from the southern states or in the southern states. There were quite a few from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, who came down and served in the South with Henry Lee, Armand Pulaski, and Anthony Wayne. The war was fought and won largely in South Carolina, but with the help of some Yankees. I hate to tell you all this, but y'all were so desperate at times that you had to let Yankees come into South Carolina. It set a terrible precedent, and we have people like Ed Forte here as a result of that.
Leon, in full disclosure, you should tell people where you live.
That's right.
I was born in Virginia.
That's Yankee.
And I lived half the year in Mount Pleasant, and somewhere north of Mason-Dixon. It's been some. But anyway, and let's get down a little farther. And part of what I'll be talking, or much of what I'll be talking about, can be found in an appendix to the pension application of David W. Sweet. Yeah. And Wilbur thought this was interesting enough to put it right on the masthead of the pension site. So if there's anything you want to check on, look up later, just turn to David W. Sweet's pension application, and you'll find it on this huge list here. So we finished all of the identified soldiers who served from the South or in the South, and now Will is working on something called South Carolina audited accounts. And these are accounts payable to mostly soldiers who served in the militia, and it gives some details about their service. Not so many details that are useful for historians, however. And I'm working on bounty land applications from the state of Virginia. And likewise, those don't give a great deal of detail about the service that soldiers did. But they are useful for descendants, for doing genealogical research. And Will and I think that they serve their country, they at least need to have their name on this list of soldiers. So we keep plugging away at those. There are two major pension acts that are useful for historical research. And the first one was passed in 1818, and it was exclusively for Continental soldiers who needed the money. And the amount of the pension for a private soldier in the Continental line was $96 a year. Not a lot of money. But if they were really impoverished, it could mean maybe a difference between going to the courthouse or not. In order to prove service, the applicant had to name his officers, usually a captain and a colonel, and his name had to occur on a payroll or other roster, which was kept in the War Department at that time. The pensions were paid out of the War Department. In 1832, Congress finally got around to recognizing militia service as well as Continentals, regardless of financial need. The amount of the pension wasn't so hot, $20 per year if they served at least 6 months service, and they could go up as high as $80 if they served at least 2 years as a militiaman or Continental soldier. Now the problem with this was that for militiamen, The rosters were almost non-existent. Very few militia rosters exist. And so the standard for proof of service had to be relaxed. And all the militia veteran had to do was provide a reasonable, believable narrative of his service. And he had to get two neighbors, one of them a preacher, to certify that the applicant had a reputation as being honest and a reputation as having been a revolutionary soldier.
Leon, one note, these are federal acts that were passed.
Yes, they're both federal.
Okay, so
Yeah.
each state has other acts to help their men out, but these are the federal acts.
These are federal. Yes, each state did also provide for the families of soldiers killed in battle and bounty land. But these are the two acts that we find most useful in doing historical research. So these are the ones I'm going to focus on. And especially the Act for 1832 in this context, because of course Marion's troops were militiamen. So most of those would have applied under the 1832 Act. Now, these two acts are one of the reasons why we don't think fraud was very common, especially for a continental soldier. His name had to be found on a roster, so that's pretty convincing evidence, unless your name is John Smith, and then the odds are good that you're going to have your name on some roster. But providing a plausible narrative of your service is not all that easy. Most of these veterans were illiterate, and you'd have to know something about the history of the war, and you'd have to be able to name some officers and so on in order to convince the pension agency to give you the money. And also, there's not that much money at stake. You really have to be impoverished to take the risk of committing fraud in order to get $20 or $80 per year. If you want to make some real dough, you become a pension agent. And you round up former soldiers, you lay down your narrative for them, and out of the goodness of your heart, you tell them, send the pension certificate to me, and on my next trip to Richmond, I'll pick up the money for you. And maybe I'll give it to you, or maybe I'll take out most of it. So there is a potential for fraud if you're a pension agent and you have a lot of clients, or if you can make up a lot of clients. And that is indeed what happened in something called the Lewis speculating gentry. And this is mentioned, I'll mention again, it's all summarized in my very long appendix in this pension application here. Lewis refers to Lewis County, which is now in the upper part of West Virginia, in those days, of course, Virginia. And gentry refers to the fact that these pension agents were 10 or a dozen of the most prominent citizens of Lewis County. One had just been elected to the state legislature. One was a lawyer, there was a physician involved, and several justices of the peace. And what they would do would find some man who looked like he might have been old enough to have served in the Revolutionary War, and he convinced them that they qualified for a pension under the 1832 Act as a militiaman. Now, some of them had actually served against Indians that were living on the frontier, of course, not necessarily during the Revolutionary War period, however. So they wouldn't have qualified under the 1832 Act. But if they looked old enough, and they were not very sophisticated perhaps, they could be convinced that they deserved a pension. So they would give their narrative of their actual service. The agent in the Lewis speculating gentry would write down a different narrative, changing the dates perhaps, increasing the amount of service to at least 2 years so they get the full pension, and then have the man put his X on the pension application. And out of the goodness of their heart, they would say, we'll have the pension certificate sent to us and we'll collect the money for you. Here's $10, or we'll give you maybe $5 out of the pension that we pick up for you in Richmond. Well, somehow word of this got out, and in about 1834, a freshly minted district attorney for the Western District of Virginia, Washington G. Singleton, was chosen to go out and investigate all of these applications that were coming from this small, sparsely populated county. And during 2 summers and autumns, he investigated 88 applicants that had their applications processed by the Lewis speculating gentry. And he was so successful at detecting fraud that he decided to expand his operations through much of what is now northern West Virginia. And he investigated another 264 applicants who had nothing to do with the Lewis speculating gentry. And this slide summarizes the results. On the left, we have the number of applications in which we can find Singleton's judgment about whether the application was fraudulent or not. Some of these files are not complete. I'll explain why in a moment. Singleton made judgments in 71 cases that were processed by the Lewis speculating gentry, and he judged 63 of them, or about 89%, to be fraudulent. And in most cases, when Singleton read what the pension application said, the man he was interviewing said, this isn't what I told the Lewis speculating gentry at all. This is something they completely made up. On the right, we have the results of Singleton's investigation of pension applications that weren't associated with the Lewis speculating gentry, and we have his judgments in 161 of those cases. He found 91 of them, or he judged 91 of them to have been fraudulent. That's about 57%. That doesn't look very good. We have no reason for believing that folks from Western Virginia were any less honest than elsewhere. So these are typical results. Then about more than half of the pension applications would be fraudulent, suspect, and I would consider that pretty useless. But there's a big difference. In the cases that weren't processed by the Lewis speculating gentry, the person that Singleton interviewed told him exactly the same story that was given in his narrative of service months before. If the application had been just totally fabricated, I doubt very seriously any of us could remember what the false story was and repeat it to Singleton. So how did Singleton conclude that 57% of these applications that had nothing to do with Lewis speculating gentry were fraudulent? And my answer is, he was a moron. I may be prejudiced because look at your handwriting. I finally learned how to read that, but it's so aggravating to read Singleton's handwriting that maybe that turned me against him, I don't know. But this is one example of the quality of his investigation. Now keep in mind, there's no telephone, and he's dealing with deliberate men, so he can't warn them that he's coming to interview them and have them tell him what their service was. He's riding around the countryside. Along the way, he interviews their neighbors, and he gets their opinion. Unsworn, anonymous opinion. And this is what this particular example says. This is in the case of one Edward Kearney. Memo. This old man is a recent settler in Ohio County. No one there knows anything of his services, but the opinion of his neighbors, so far as I learned, it is highly unfavorable to him. They don't know anything about it, but what they said is not very good. Okay. I was unable to gather anything from his manner of detailing his services. It seems to me, however, that he was rather too zealous in the cause. 18 months continuous service for a militiaman in 3 several tours is, in my opinion, rather overdoing the matter. Because the man volunteered to serve 3 consecutive tours of 6 months each, obviously he's a fraud and not a patriot. This is typical. You read through some of these reports that Singleton filed. He makes comments like a dumb German, an ignorant Irishman. He has a severe prejudice against anybody living on the other side of the Appalachian chain. He was from sophisticated Winchester, Virginia, after all. So what was the actual percentage of fraud among applicants who weren't associated with Lewis speculating gentry? My estimate is 4% fraud. How did I get to that? Well, there are 181 cases not associated with the Lewis speculating gentry, in which we have both Singleton's verbatim or summary of what the interviewee told him, and also the original pension application, written at least several months apart. I have all 181 of them here in rank and file, and out of those, if you compare what the original pension application said with what they told Singleton, 19 or 11%, those enclosed in this green box, misstated their length of service. Now that's not too surprising because these are militiamen. Generally serve 3-month tours, several tours of 3 months. It would be very easy for them to forget one tour or think they served a tour that they didn't actually serve. And this isn't too significant anyway to historians because only a descendant might be interested in the exact number of tours they served. So I don't know if you can see this, but I've painted their cheeks red. They're blushing because they made a mistake with length of service. We have 8 out of the 181, or 4%, who misstated engagements, officers, and information that is important to us. And their pants are on fire. 96% non-fraudulent is what I estimate. And if this is typical of the degree of fraud among pension applications, then I feel pretty good that Will and I haven't wasted 14, 15 years of our lives transcribing these. I think they might be of some use to historians. I don't think even the official accounts of battles could be said to be 96% accurate. So I think this is quite reassuring. Now, keep in mind, this only addresses the question of fraud. The whole question of whether they remembered correctly is a different thing. We'll look at that a little bit in a moment, and also we'll be treated to an actual example this evening with the entertainment. So now we come to the first question. What did the pension applicant say about Marion? And also, how does it compare with received history, which, much as we hate to admit it derives largely from Parson Weems, which he attributed to, or I might say blamed on, Peter Horry. 467 pension applications refer to Francis Marion. None of them called him Swamp Fox, of course. That's a much later term. I haven't been able to actually track down who the first man was who called him the Swamp Fox. Most of the pension applications mention engagements and officers that are consistent with Weems Horry and also consistent with other historical sources. So that's reassuring as well. Their memories seem to be pretty good. They remember exact battles and the officers that they served with. The ones I find most interesting are the ones who give details that are different from what you find in Weems and different from what you find in usual history books. And here's one example, the crossing of Black Mingo Bridge in autumn of 1780. And what Weems says, pretending to quote Horry, the surprise and destruction of the Tories would be complete, except that the horses' feet made too much noise on the bridge. And after that, Marion always put blankets on the bridge to muffle the sound of the horses. Now, John Haller has noted in his excellent biography of Marion, this makes Marion look pretty stupid. I mean, didn't he know that horses' hooves make noise when they're crossing the bridge at night? I mean, you'd think he would have thought of that beforehand. And in fact, John has also noted that apparently he did. There are 5 pension applications that say at Black Mingo Bridge, Marion had blankets put down on the bridge to muffle the sound of the horses' hooves. And I couldn't find a single pension application that said he did that after Black Mingo Bridge. So Weems has it totally backwards. The blankets were on the bridge at Black Mingo, and he didn't think of it later. The fact that 5 independent pension applicants mentioned this indicates it must have made quite an impression on them, and probably because the horses have made quite an impression on their blankets. But I can't help wondering what shape they were in when they went to bed that night. Oh, here's a slide I've seen before. This is the depiction of the famous sweet potato dinner with a British officer. And this is the version that appears in Parson Weems' book. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll just point to the word dinner there, which is in italics in the original. And so this has been the story's been handed down to us as having a dinner of sweet potatoes. There's one pension applicant, however, who said it was a breakfast rather than a dinner. During the times of General Marion, a British officer, as he was told, this is a second-hand account. The applicant doesn't pretend to have been there at the time. came into camp, but for what, he does not know. He was roasting, I guess being Marion, was roasting and baking sweet potatoes on the coals. General Marion stepped up with the British officer and remarked he believed he would take up breakfast. He felt proud of the request, pulled out his potatoes, wiped the ashes off with a dirty handkerchief, and placed them on a pine log, which was all the provision he had. And Marion and the British officer partook of them. He has been told by some that this has been recorded in the life of the general as dinner, but this was a breakfast. He's probably referring to Weems's history. Well, what do you do with something like this? This is just one account versus what Weems said. In the case with the blankets on the Black Mingo Bridge, I think those are pretty credible because you've got 5 independent sources saying the same thing. When I find something like this, one singular account, I just file it in the back of my head, and maybe someday some other independent confirmation will come along. But in this particular case, it just depends on whether you trust Weems or you trust Samuel Weaver. Here's another case. Of course, Weems emphasized Marion's humane treatment of the captured enemy. And here's a famous episode in which the mulatto fellow who was suspected to have been the one who killed Marion's nephew, Gabriel, was murdered by one of Marion's officers. And Marion flew into a rage against the captain of the guard, because the captain didn't instantly kill the person who assassinated the mulatto fellow. What do the pension applicants say about Marion's treatment of captured enemy? Well, it's mixed. Here at the top we have one case where at Fort Mott, presumably in May 1781, Marion ordered us not to hang any more Tories. He said, let them enlist during the war and watch them close, and they would make good soldiers. And then 2 or 3 weeks later at Georgetown, we have this pension applicant saying, among the people preparing the siege at Georgetown was a yellow fellow who was said to have furnished cattle and provisions to the British, and Marion had him hung for selling provisions to the British. So here we have a situation where we get 2 different pictures of Marion's treatment of captured enemy. This version here, frankly, is about as shocking as hearing that George Washington might have told a lie. It just doesn't fit in with the movie, does it? That particular scene wound up on the editing floor. One other thing I want to point out here is that this mentions that during the siege, Marion had Quaker guns prepared. I've never seen this mentioned anywhere else. And again, it's just one of those singular instances, kind of thing you file away in the back of your head, and maybe some confirming evidence will come along. This raises the question of how much can we trust Weems? And again, reluctant as we may be to accept it, I think all of our impressions of Marion, our favorable impressions, originate with Weems. And this paragraph here, for example, he said, putting words in Ori's mouth, he said he'd long courted friendship with Marion because he was, although he was neither handsome nor witty nor wealthy, he was universally beloved because of his fairness, of his character, his fondness for his relations and humanity to his slaves, his bravery in the Indian War. He was the darling of the country. But Ori disavowed this characterization in the margin of his own personal copy of Ween's book. So, are our impressions well-founded? Were they shared by Marion's